I'm very pleased now to hand over to Gisela Stuart, who will chair this opening panel. Gisela is a crossbench life peer and former Labour MP. During her 20 years as an MP, she served on a number of parliamentary committees, including the Intelligence and Security Committee, the Defence Committee, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, the Social Security Select Committee. She was also a minister in the Department for Health. And in 2016, she was chair of the Vote Leave campaign during the EU referendum. And she's now the first Civil Service Commissioner and the chair of Wilton Park. So she is absolutely the perfect person to chair this opening panel. I'm very pleased to hand you over to her. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Munira. And if I just add to Munira's introduction, because Munira is always very much too polite about things, this reference to public life, what I really want you to think about today and tomorrow, if you think there's a state of disorder, if you think things aren't the way you want them to be, life is not a spectator sport. Join, enter public life and work towards bringing about change. That's really what makes a difference. And I hope that today and tomorrow will be about that we can discuss how you can actually make a difference and shape the world we live in. We've got a panel of, and we're talking about state of the nation, resilience in the era of disorder. We've got 3 speakers who will make introductory comments, and we have got a period of discussion on the panel, and then I'll invite you to ask questions. And when we were discussing the sequence of speaking, I thought we should end up with probably the most optimistic, most useful optimistic note. So I've sort of picked on Samo Burja to give us a critique with some suggestions as to where we might be going. Samo is the founder and president of Bismark Analysis and a senior research fellow in political science at the Foresight Institute and a research fellow at the Long Now Foundation. So would you like to kick us off with some real critical comments?
Well, I feel I've been set up where you are supposed to be the pessimist and the critic, and I think there's a very thin line between being the pessimist and the critic and being just a complainer. However, I think the people who say all is well are actually lulling us back into a very dangerous sleep. So even the complainers are performing, I think, a useful function in our society, which hopefully capitalizes one of the greatest advantages of open societies, which is that critiques can be raised by intelligent people from all strata, and that at times things can be said that are inconvenient, right? Inconvenient to educated, administrative, and other elites. So let me immediately propose that the core problem that the United Kingdom faces, the core problem that is actually the same problem that is faced by the Western world as a whole. 200 years ago or so, depending on which historian you ask, the Industrial Revolution began here. Let me propose that maybe it also has ended here. Britain bet, as many other developed countries did, on a society that called itself post-industrial. A post-industrial society was supposed to be a rich service economy. It was supposed to have gains from trade of a globalized world with common rules of a common framework of rules, a common set of mutually beneficial arrangements, and it was supposed to be the next step in development. And eventually, presumably, right, all societies would be post-industrial and all the manufacturing would be done by machines. I don't think anyone quite said it explicitly, but everyone, of course, planned on the developing world one day becoming developed. The one big part of the developing world that did become developed, China, immediately caused problems because they had their own idea, and they have their own idea, of how the world works. They also do not hesitate to engage in what I feel people in the United States call overproduction. In other words, building a lot of stuff at a very high level of quality in huge quantities very, very cheaply. It's not clear what exactly the West is supposed to continue building. I would perhaps say CPUs and so on, but that's not true. CPUs are built in East Asia, even if they're designed in California. Software is another good that was supposed to be fully globalized, where you could have a software giant based in London and it would have 7 billion users. That's no longer true. It's not just China that has removed itself from the global internet behind the Great Firewall. India is pursuing policies to cultivate its own domestic technology giants. And these giants seem about as capable of innovation, including in fields like artificial intelligence, as anything in the United States or Britain. If we look at leading the world in environmentalism, the green policies have to some extent succeeded in seeding alternative technologies. I think battery technology is well on the way to revolutionizing the economy in many positive ways. However, it is also the case that carbon emissions have been mostly exported, not eliminated. So if we judge green policy on its own terms, it is a failure. The result has been deindustrialization of Britain, which on the margin results in more manufacturing in China, which results in the final analysis in about as much emissions as before, maybe more. So all of these things are downstream of policy failures that are driven by bureaucracies and institutions pursuing whatever the local consensus is with little course correction from the outside, be it the green movement, be it the entire field of economics, be it the foreign policy establishment that was so confident that China becoming wealthy means it'll become democratic and it'll be our friend. All of these have not updated on evidence. You know, perhaps the pessimist in me suggests that they will only update once key people retire. There's a saying that science progresses one funeral at a time. I think the same might be true of foreign policy and economics and all these other areas. As soon as you support a policy as a politician or a civil servant, or even as an academic, if you back a theory, that's your career. You're only going to be 25, 35, 45 once. And you have to defend that almost no matter what. Perhaps only taking a break from defending whatever, millstone you've tied around your neck once you retire. I think that the United Kingdom, as such, could lean into a policy of energy abundance that could compensate key structural problems that are now global problems, such as low fertility, no longer an issue just for developed countries, but an issue for developing countries. India currently has a TFR of 2.0. 2.1 would be a total fertility rate that will allow a renewal of the population. We are probably going to see in the late 21st century a planet where labor costs just go up quite a bit, and the population might even be smaller. The total global population might be smaller by the end of this century than it is now. I challenge my mainstream economist colleagues to give me a story from mainstream economics where this world with a smaller population will be a richer world. I think they have a hard time coming up with those arguments. So concretely, what I'm saying is if labor costs go up, energy costs, if they went down, could partially substitute that both in manufacturing, but presumably in this nebulous service sector that we've bet our entire civilization on through energy-hungry applications such as artificial intelligence. I don't think Britain will do this. I don't even think China is doing this. Their targets for nuclear energy are not an ambitious new age of the atom. They literally want to imitate the energy mix of the United States. And the most fundamental failure, then, of the United Kingdom and of the Western world currently is a lack of imagination. It is that we are committed to this same story of low carbon emissions, a globalization that won't happen because it politically can't happen, and an AI revolution that for now is sticking to email rather than even stuff like, folding laundry, let alone stuff like building the chips themselves. We are far away from a fully automated economy, and we are mismanaging our human capital, and we are deluding ourselves about the effects, the positive effects on the planet of our environmental policies. Thank you.
Well, no, thank you very much. Now, Joel, you are the author of 10 books, it tells me, but the one which I thought maybe many of us in here feel we ought to be reading is The Coming of Neo-Feudalism.
I should have already read it.
A warning to the global middle class. That's true, we should have. We had a few years to read it in,
Right.
so, okay. Available on Amazon or anywhere else. He's also Presidential Fellow in the Urban Futures of Chapman University in Orange, California, and Executive Director of Chapman's Center for Demographics and Policy. Now, you are going to try and give us a slightly different perspective of what it looks like from the outside, and
Right.
also with some suggestions of what we might be doing.
Well, yeah, I will try. I'm actually going to, Samo gave me a lot of good things to talk about, but, just as Britain was the prototype of the Industrial Revolution, the state that I've lived in for 50 years, the state of California, is the actual center of the Information Revolution. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's actually happened in California, and it's not necessarily such a great story. The process that has occurred in California is one in which the technology sector now has almost complete dominance of the economy. But what's weird about it is, as we went through a period of tremendous prosperity, what happened afterwards is actually what I would call the model for the new feudalism, which is there's a relatively small group of people who are doing extraordinarily well, and up until recently were able to keep the state from being in an enormous deficit, and was providing at least enough jobs to keep a good part of the population going. What's happened in more recent years is, as globalization, as you discussed, more and more and more of the functions of the California economy, which is the leading, I would say, cultural, intellectual center on the planet right now, not for long maybe, but what we did is we kept exporting those functions. A clear case is NVIDIA. NVIDIA now the most highly valued company in the world. I don't think that will last too long. But it's a company that founded by immigrants, which is a great story, but on the other hand, does almost they do all their manufacturing in the Far East. They actually only get about 7% of their revenues from the US. So fundamentally, what we did is we exported a huge amount. Then at the same time, we were in the lead on the environmental side. So California decided that it was going to save the planet by itself. And so what we did is we imposed a lot of regulations that other states and other countries weren't even thinking about doing. So what's happened is we have really exported our carbon emissions. And I have to use the word idiot. The idiots who run California today don't get the point that if it's a crisis, it's a global crisis, not a California crisis. So it doesn't really matter if we are in a situation where we are essentially importing from other countries stuff that we don't want to make in this country. And of course, the weird thing, we've done some of this analysis, actually, because of what we call leakage, the leakage is greater than what we've been saving. Because essentially, industries that used to be in California are now elsewhere. I'll give you an example. If you want to get concrete, it's very energy-intensive industry. If you did it in California for California purposes, it would be much better. And this is sort of very similar to what you have here in the UK. We've decided, no, we don't want that dirty kind of stuff. So what we did is, okay, now we're going to bring our concrete in from Arizona, where the weather is, basically hellish, and requires enormous amounts of energy to just do, and drive it over. Or we can get it from Mexico, where it's also quite warm, and where the labor regulations and the environmental regulations are much weaker. So what we've done is we've created a situation where we have an economy that is fundamentally based on a relatively small number of people. Now, I teach a class at Chapman with the head of our data analytics program on the social implications of AI, and I think we can see pretty much what's happening. And that is that the AI revolution is basically eliminating enormous numbers of jobs. At the time that everyone is hysterical about AI, Google and Meta, and I just got an email from a former student of mine about she and her husband both lost their jobs. They're up in San Francisco because their companies are trying to put all their money into AI. So if you're an AI engineer at the very top level, you'll do great. But all those people in the middle, and particularly the younger people, in the class I teach was in the graduate school, almost everybody is in a company, some kept running the company, and they keep telling me about how many jobs are going to be eliminated. In many cases, they say their own job is going to be eliminated. So this is certainly something to be concerned about. The other part of it is the social side. In the past, California, like the US, which still has it to some extent, we had a very diversified economy. We had a huge oil industry, huge aerospace industry, huge manufacturing industry, the leading agricultural industry in the world. And what have we done? We've made it almost impossible for those industries to continue to grow and support people. So what's happened is we have this enormous inequality that is really quite astounding. California has the most billionaires of any place in the world and the highest level of poverty in the United States. We have more people living in overcrowded housing. I've done presentations. I can show you pictures of housing where, particularly, this is in Santa Ana, which is a predominantly Latino city near where I live, where families are essentially forced to live, mother, father, child, in the kitchen of an apartment. This is California in 2024. So I think what we also are seeing is a social disillusion. So we have the failure of the environmental policy, we have an over-reliance on one industry, and then we have the society that itself is beginning to sort of break down in many areas, whether it's in crime, terrible school results. So, although I think that in many ways what California represents and what America represents, which has always been sort of the cutting edge and the great cause for hope, and that still exists, I don't think that right now we're such a great role model. And so if England and the UK is an example of what happens at the end of the Industrial Revolution, we may be getting a glimpse of what is at the end of the post-industrial revolution. One of the big problems here is that this has allowed an enormous growth of a surveillance state. China's perfected it, but we're getting there. You have a very small number of companies who are completely dominant. The big tech companies, including the two of them up in the Seattle area, have bigger GDPs than most of the major industrial countries in the world. They're actually worth more than Mexico. And I mean, this is not really what we really want to see. So I think ultimately, when we think about the future, the technology should be something that improves things for people, but it shouldn't be the thing that we think is going to solve our problems. We're going to solve our problems on a social basis. We're going to solve our problems by, for instance, you mentioned the low birth rates. We're going to obviously need immigration, but do we have to bring immigration in that integrates into the society, doesn't provide a separate society, and that's one of the big problems we have in the U.S. right now. And we deal with this in California because our population is about 55% non-white. So I think that a lot of the solutions are going to come really at the grassroots level. It's going to be whether we can improve education, whether kids are being taught the basic Western values so that they understand why their families moved to this part of the world. I think we're going to need to think about, should so much wealth be concentrated in so few hands? The idea that somebody is worth $80 billion is just terrifying to me. And I think the founding fathers would have said the same thing. Certainly Madison would have. So I think that there's enormous opportunities. I have witnessed in the last 40 or 50 years in California some great things, I was in Silicon Valley when it was just starting, and there's been enormous improvements. But we have to think about how we use the transition to post-industrial society in a way that helps the vast majority of the population. Because where we're headed now is we're headed to a quasi-feudal society, which is dominated by a relatively small number of people. And I think that's the biggest challenge, and also probably the biggest reason for the increase in illiberalism around the world.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, it falls onto Mike Bird to cheer us all up.
You can do it.
We'll see.
He is the Asia Business and Finance editor at The Economist, based in Singapore. He does the weekly podcast, Money Talks, and there's a book not yet published, as I gather.
Not yet.
But you put it on your shopping list, The Land Trap, which tells the story of how the world's oldest asset continues to shape the global economy today. Over to you, Mike.
Great. Well, when you finish reading Joel's 10 books, it's about a year until mine comes out, so you've got enough time. Munira called up the front desk of the neoliberal world order, and I was passed on the assignment of the defense. It got me thinking, looking at the panel, about the word resilience. I guess I'm the representative of a disorder as well. Resilience is the sort of word. I was given some advice when I first became a journalist that if you could use the antonym for a word in a headline and a headline no longer made sense, then you shouldn't use it. So Prime Minister calls for strong economy. The Prime Minister wouldn't call for a weak economy, so it's not a good headline. I think nobody would call for vulnerability or weakness, right? The normal antonyms for resilience. So I was thinking about what we're really saying here. And I think we're talking about resilience against efficiencies of various sorts. Now, if we think of resilience as an expense, which I think it's reasonable enough to think it of, it's a form of insurance, right? It may insure you against various crisis risks. It may insure you against intermittency or security issues, but somebody has to pay for insurance. That's the biggest thing that I would like you to take away from what I'm saying here today. Somebody has to pay. Whether that's consumers in the form of higher prices, whether that's businesses in the form of narrower margins, whether that's taxpayers in the form of higher taxes to pay for subsidies, the sort of things that we're talking about cost money. And I think there's a lack of rigor when we speak about these things. We talk about them in very general terms. The problem is resilience isn't an economic concept, really. We're merging these two worlds of sort of security and economics in a difficult way. I think as well that if you are a critic of the current world order, world disorder, however you want to frame it, you should feel pretty good about that because you are in the ascendancy. You are winning. If you think that modern market economies and the liberal world order and cross-border vulnerabilities have turned the world into something it shouldn't be, and we need to go back to a time with a higher level of sort of dignity and work and self-reliance on a national scale, then it's good because the President of the United States and the people who work for him basically agree with you. Whoever wins the presidency this year will basically agree with you. The Chancellor of the Exchequer in a month's time will agree with you. This is the rising group, I would say, in the world today. What I worry about is that it's still a group mostly comprised of critics rather than people bringing ideas to the table about how the world should change and what trade-offs we should actually be making in changing from the world as it is today. And I think on top of that, one of the challenges this conference will talk a lot about, I imagine, is the role for a more active state. I think there's also a bit of disingenuousness in the discussions around resilience because it's a convenient parcel for all sorts of things that people wanted to do anyway, right? I grew up with a much more placid, I suppose, world environment. People wanted to bring manufacturing jobs back already. They worried about trade vulnerabilities already. They worried about inequality. It's completely reasonable to worry about those things. But I think we have to be explicit in what we're talking about, we're trying to address. Resilience is a catch-all for these things. I think it's a little bit insufficient. Where does Britain come into this? And I think this is obviously the crucial question for this conference. If we think about a more resilient world, it's a more fragmented world. It's a world in which large blocks rely more on their own production. They turn inwards a little bit. Again, completely reasonable to believe that you need that for your security. It's a point of view. So you can imagine big blocks in the world that might do well in relative terms out of this setup. America will probably be fine. Enormous domestic market, enormous national capacity. China will probably do fine. It already does to some extent. It's reliant on an export-led model, but it's quite insular. You could maybe make an argument that the EU will get itself together. You could maybe make an argument that India will be in the group of countries eventually that does okay from this model. You'll notice that Britain is not in one of these blocks, right? And it isn't going to be in one of these blocks. I would say with a relatively small domestic market, the idea of self-sufficiency, resilience, whatever we want to call it, massively disadvantages smaller places. We should seriously consider that, I think. I think you should be careful what you wish for in terms of a more empowered state, too. I would like everyone in the audience to seriously think for a moment about the British state. And I would like you to think of something that you think the British state is doing well right now. And then I would like you to ask the question of whether you'd like it to have more responsibilities and whether you think it would do well at that. To me, the answer is probably not. And I think to conclude, this isn't a very optimistic talk actually, but to conclude on a slightly more optimistic note, there is a lot to be said for, I think, basically what Sam Bowman said at last year's conference, which is getting the basics right. Okay? There's a lot of things that liberals and post-liberals would all agree on that need to get out of the way before any of the progress either group would like to see can be achieved. You can't build things in California, right? You literally can't build them. I'm not talking about like tech companies or whatever, you physically can't build them. Whether we go for a sort of more liberal future or a more resilient one, you'll need to be able to build things. You'll need energy abundance, right? These are things we can all agree on, and I think these are the barnacles on the boat that need to come off before we discuss exactly where we're going. Yeah, that's it.
It's not I didn't try to get this off into a cheerful note, but I singularly failed. So let me try and put to the panel to look at this from a slightly different angle. Some of us in here are old enough that back in 1978, UK had to go to the IMF for a loan because the economy was about to go seriously awry. And in 2008, at the height of the financial crisis, there was a gathering of those who were involved in 1968, and they were reflecting. And I said to them, is 2008 a bit like 1968? And they said to me, no, it's not. Sorry, 78. No, it's not. They said, when we had to go to the IMF, it was a bit like the patient who had a heart attack arriving at A&E, and we know what a heart attack is. We know what we can do about it. The one thing we don't know is whether this is going to work on this particular patient. They said 2008, the patient arrived at A&E, and we looked at them and went, you really shouldn't have been put together like this. And so in terms of your analysis, is the current disorder, and I do sometimes wonder whether we get nostalgic about unduly nostalgic about the past, is it that a sign that the old model simply has had its day, and we need to engineer and re-question some of our fundamental views on the classical liberalism of free markets? Or is it a case that we're just going through a bit of a rough patch where some problems are recurring? Demography is kind of changing in a sense. It's not just low birth rate, but also systems designed for 3 generations suddenly have to deal with 4, 5 generations. Is it just we need to sort of adjust the realities, but the old model still works? Or do we really need to look at a new model?
Is this for me in particular?
Oh, generally on the panel, I just would like the panel to address that fundamental challenge.
There are a variety of models, some of which work for smaller countries as well, where it would be difficult to say that, say, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, or even China truly bet on unrestrained global efficiencies. Like their policies were bets on globalization, but there were bets that favored the development of particular industrial centers at home. right? If I were to imagine a modern American analog to this, well, maybe the United States should declare a special economic zone, grab something out of the control of the Californian state, maybe make it a nice federal territory, pick one city in America, have that be the place where you want to do agglomeration, right? Like, people willing to do things like that in South Korea, in Taiwan, in Japan, and in China, where you could criticize this as picking winners, but really, it's about making your companies as competitive as possible in the world. And if the companies are innovative and efficient, then you get Taiwan. And if, they are not, well, then you get an ailing economy. But I think that the challenge of reindustrialization, I honestly don't think that it'll happen through like global free trade. I don't think the West has many advantages at all at this point.
For what it's worth, I don't think reindustrialization is a challenge. I'm sure you would get some reindustrialization by doing things well in the first place. I suppose we must have very different models of the world, because Taiwan, to me, it's definitely chosen a particular industry to be good at, but it's just about the most globally exposed place in the world, right? You cut off a week of Air Liquide shipments to the Taiwanese semiconductor industry, and it's gone. Everything stops, right? I can't think of a country more globally exposed than Taiwan.
I opened, though, by saying that it is a bet on globalization, right? So I was not proposing that actually as an example of resilience, but an example of economic prosperity, where I believe your argument on small countries is correct. Small countries do need global trade, or they at least need large trading partners. And it's, impossible to pretend otherwise. I don't think there's any reason to have an industrial economy that integrates fewer than 300 or 400 million people, right? Like Russia, modern Russia is arguably too small to have a real industrial base on any rational economic basis. But the thing is, China isn't, right? And China has exited the previous world of globalization already. That's one of the reasons why I'm so certain that that model is over, because it wasn't our choice to push China away. China exited on its own. China has its own national security considerations. And what does globalization look like when 1 billion people exit globalization? I've not heard an answer.
I don't follow. How did they leave globalization?
They straightforwardly are, in several important ways, blocking competition from the Western world. Straightforwardly in, for example, the tech world, right? They opened with the innovation, and I do think we have to acknowledge it as an innovation, even if an unwelcomed one, of extensive social media censorship, automated, right? It's something that we are starting to adopt piecemeal in the Western world. Maybe not the best sort of example to follow, but still, China has real national security interests. China made real concerted state investments to favor particular industries to make them more competitive, right? It was government subsidies of a variety of shape. Not all subsidies are inefficient in this narrow sense, right? You can subsidize a company without destroying the company. It's of course true that a bad subsidy can destroy a good firm. I actually think that's a very important insight economists have provided. But I think that China basically showed that, it could build basically everything that 8 billion people needed.
I'm just wondering, Mike, because you're based out in Singapore, are we actually deluding ourselves that China ever was in the club?
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
they haven't exited; they never properly entered.
I suppose there's a few. We're thinking along different lines, I think, in the sense that I don't think the idea that China was ever going to become a liberal democracy was a particularly important part of the acceptance of China as a commercial power. It was probably a small part of it. I don't think it was that important. I don't think people have thought that for a very long time, frankly. I certainly don't know people who think that. The reality was you could try to frustrate the growth of a country of that size or not, right? And people chose not to. Now, it's a perfectly reasonable thing to look today and again look at security concerns, particularly on the part of the US, things that the US needs for its defense industrial base, for that side of security. But I don't really think there was ever a moment where there was a decision made that China would eventually be this sort of liberal paradise. Yeah, I do think there's an element of, perhaps it was diluted if people did think that. I'm not sure all that many did. But.
I mean, there's the argument that 2008 was the moment when the global markets failed, and China at that moment decided that there were alternative routes. But what does it look like from...
I'm actually going to say something optimistic or quasi-optimistic, so don't throw me out. One is, I think there are some good things going on. I mean, now, look, I think that, unfortunately, a nation of 330 million people is going to have a choice between a doddering person and a maniac. So, that's not the best choice. But what is true is there is a consciousness in the United States that we can't give away all those concerns, particularly on the defense side. Having spent quite a bit of time on the aerospace industry in California, I think that there is some consciousness there, which is, I think, positive. But I also want to say a couple things in defense of Western values that I think are intrinsic values and advantages. One is the free market is astounding in what it can do and what it can produce. Now, I think there's a problem when you get to the size of an Amazon and a Google, and they first of all, as a good friend of mine who knows all those guys says, they become unbelievably arrogant. They think they have the solution to everything, and they're not such great people. But it is out of that free market economy that I watched in the Silicon Valley 70s and 80s that really drove innovation in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time. Probably the best analogy would probably be Britain in the first half of the 19th century. But when you think about it, take NVIDIA, which I raised earlier. NVIDIA is founded by a Chinese immigrant. You look at the companies, many of these companies are run by people who came from someplace else. So what is the other great advantage besides free market? I think the biggest advantage is it's just a better place to live. You ask Indian, I've had many Indian students in particular, or you ask Chinese students, you ask people from the Middle East, why are you in the United States? Why are you in Britain? Because you're freer, and there is an economic value to the idea that people are free, that they don't feel that they're going to be censored with anything that they say, that the state has the right, at least as of now, to go and arrest them for having dissenting views. They are going to try to prevent you from saying those things on the internet or through the big platforms. But there is an enormous appeal. I have a friend who teaches at the University of Leeds, who's Chinese. And when I asked her, I said, "What are you doing here?" She says, "Because I'm free here. Because I can say what I want, and I don't have to worry that I say the wrong thing and they're going to go after me and they're going to go after my family." So while we may need an adjustment, we should not throw out the enormous advantages of a free market, not an oligarchic market, as we unfortunately have a little too much of, but also the fact that people have basic freedom to make choices in their lives. And that is a value which we originally took from Britain ourselves, and I think is one of the great things that the West has. And it's not just UK and the US that are getting people, Australia, Canada. You go to Toronto, my wife's Canadian, so I have to say something nice about Canada. People they come to Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver because it's just a better place to live. And if you've spent enough time, and I've spent quite a bit of time in China, the quality of life just isn't there. Yeah, and the amount of freedom isn't there. So although we have many problems we need to solve, we shouldn't throw out the fact that our model is a fundamentally good model. We just need to make some adjustments.
Can I just, before I open up to... Never come between the applause given to a speaker.
That's
Ought to be
right, yeah.
recognized. The big mistake. But before I open
But then
up...
they can buy the book.
Before I open it up to question, I just want to throw one more question to all three of you. And it takes me back to the role of the markets. Arguably, the post-war German economic success model was, social markets. Ludwig Erhard, whose basic theory when you look at it was that markets are social. You don't have to make them social. And the reason why they are social is because they prevent the build-up of dominating monopolies. And therefore the role of the state in that is to provide a framework within which they operate. And we started earlier with that question of the role of the state. Is it something that maybe we've got the balance of this wrong, rather than saying, free trade isn't what will deliver us? And I think, Mike, you made that point when you said, resilience, someone's got to pay for it at some stage. Have we just become unrealistic of what the state can do and what the state should do in order to allow social markets to operate? Mike, do you want to kick us off? Or?
Sure. I think from my perspective, it's a matter of playing to the strengths your country has as it stands. I think when we talk about models, some countries in East Asia did genuinely make decisions. You can pick a handful of economic policymakers and you can say what happened in that country stems from this handful of discrete decisions made by individuals we can identify. UK manufacturing started losing competitiveness against German manufacturing like the 1870s, 1880s. Yeah. So it's not like anyone sat down and said, I'm thinking of this thing called a flat white, and I think we're going to sell them to each other in the future. So let's disadvantage our manufacturing sector now, right? For a number of reasons, it turned out as something we weren't as good at. I don't know whether it's the best job of the government to always lean against those things, right? There's a certain amount that you have to do for, again, resilience, not unreasonable, you just have to pay for it. But you should play to your strengths. And I think that a lot of countries spend a lot of time thinking about ways to play against their strengths. I think it happens a lot in the US now. It's always happened in the UK. I think you get a lot of sort of idealizing about the way other people live. I mean, look, for example, at the German economy now. You've had a lot of people in the UK who've sort of fantasized about this ideal German economy for a number of years. It doesn't look so great anymore. And this is a Western country that has prioritized manufacturing, it has prioritized industry. So I don't think there's a right answer, but I do think understanding what your strengths are, how to lean against them where appropriate, and how to lean into them where it gives you the most advantage is crucial.
Well, a couple things on the government. The scary thing that's happened with government has been the unionization of the public sector. And as the private sector gets weaker, that public sector interest becomes greater. For instance, in my state of California, our brilliant government has decided, at pressure from the teachers' unions, to essentially abandon phonics in teaching school. And this is a disaster, particularly for kids from minority families who aren't, they're not like my kids growing up, being read children's stories from Australia. They're in a much more difficult situation. So we have a problem, and we were talking about this earlier, that in the UK, the Labour Party's danger is it really now represents the public sector. It doesn't really represent the private sector and the wealth-creating sectors. So that's one problem we have with government. I think government can do a really great job, but we should not allow the amount of power that the public employee unions have in the United States. I'm sure it's true, I know it's true in Canada. I'm sure it's true here in the UK.
Sorry, this is just rubbish.
You think so?
I'm sorry, Michael. This is unbelievable for you to say at this point. I mean, none of you have talked about income inequality.
I think you may not have listened.
We'll come to the questions, and that'll be right.
And then the other. So anyway, but I did write a book about neo-feudalism. I don't know. I think it dealt with it. The other thing that is in terms of government, and I don't know how applicable it is here in the UK, is in the US, the thing that sort of saves our bacon, if you will, is federalism. Because different states can adjust to what's good for them and what they want. So I'm actually writing a piece right now where I basically is saying you don't have to worry about the election. The red states already won. Because if you take a look at migration, and growth of income, improvement in terms of migration, even immigrants, the three leading immigrant destinations in the United States today are Miami, Dallas, and Houston. They're not New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, which were historical. So I think if there's some way to have different parts of a country come up with policies that make sense for those places where there's more input and you have less control from one particular group of people, I think works much better. I mean, I think one of the big problems that you might have in a country like the UK is it's so dominated by one region, and the other regions, are basically, well, as one MP said, it's the southwest of England, and the rest of it is Russia, but without the resources. And so I think that there are new and different models that we might want to look at. And the one thing, again, that I think has worked relatively well in the U.S. is if industry can't make it in California or New York, they can go to Texas, they can go to Florida, they can go to Arizona. And that's something that we might want to think about as not having a policy directed by a central bureaucracy, but think about how we can disperse governmental power and make government more efficient and responsive.
Samo.
A lot has been said about China and the United States of America, so let me just maybe close on my end at least with talking a bit about Britain and what its actual advantages might be. I think the model that would actually fit the United Kingdom's political culture, social culture, quite well is actually Sweden, and not Sweden the social democracy, but Sweden, one of the most successful capitalist countries in the world. Yes, where it is an economy that is an export-driven economy, where basically the funding for the welfare state comes from these incredibly efficient, innovative firms that export to the entire world. It's not just IKEA, it's, aircraft, submarines, steel. Actually, did you know that Sweden profitably exports steel? Yeah. Britain could maybe learn from that. And that involves, in the Swedish example, some amount of government power and some amount of actually solid industrial policy, where you're not trying to save a failing industry, but nurture an emerging one or sharpen an existing high area of competency. So I think the United Kingdom has truly remarkable human capital. It actually has cheap labor in a particular category: mathematicians, writers, lawyers. Unfortunately, there's an underdeveloped country where everyone speaks English, and it's called England, right? I've even benefited from the labor arbitrage myself, though I try to offer wages as fair as the Californian ones, but that's economically rational of me. I should be more efficient, actually. Actually, the UK has plenty of people who don't want to leave. A lot of them very well educated. A lot of them want to make a lot of money. And that money, once it's a successful firm, it can fund even relatively inefficient social programs, but they could be efficient. So the final point I would make about Sweden is this one, actually. The United Kingdom has to think differently from the United States, and it has to think differently than other Western countries. Brexit does give the UK an advantage. It gives it the advantage that it could reinvent itself. It can be distinct and can pursue a sort of independent-minded policy. I note that Sweden, as bureaucratic as it is, Swedish health officials looked at the COVID data, and they didn't copy US policy, and they didn't copy Chinese policy, and they didn't copy EU policy. They made their own decision. So that's what good civil servants should do, I think.
Just to add, also one element is also Sweden has really developed its hydroelectric power.
Of course.
So it has relatively
and
cheap
nuclear.
power. And nuclear. So they're
cheap energy, yeah.
If you're going to have an industrial economy, and increasingly if you're going to have AI, you've got to have enormous energy capacity.
Yeah. What I would like us to urge to stay away from is the Thomas Cook of have a bit of this and have a bit of that, and because that works here, they must be working there. I still start the day with reading the press cuttings from Paris, Berlin, Washington, and London, and there really are days when I feel like saying insert country, because the problems are exactly the same. And I remember during COVID, at the beginning of COVID, the Germans were miles ahead because they had this sort of, granular data which a properly federal system had. But then when it came to the vaccine rollout, the monolith of the NHS just delivered the jabs across the country, So I think But the challenge we've got to look at is, do these systems which we operate, do we think they need to change? And I think the role of the state in that sense as well, what matters there, and it's, is neoliberalism, has it sown the seeds of its own destructions, or can it survive because we just adjust, because ultimately liberal markets always deliver something better. Can we open to questions? And the gentleman in the lime green shirt who got very agitated.
That's the most important thing, and I apologise.
No, but would you like to ask a question?
My whole thing, and I've read your book on neoliberalism, and it's a brilliant book. And it's a brilliant book.
Well, and you bought it, so...
I'm one of the few people in the room that paid money, and I apologise for being rude. What I found extraordinary about the whole thing, and forgive me, I'm going to say this very politely. In fact, I'm not going to say it politely. The idea that government doesn't make a difference is completely ludicrous.
And who made that argument?
The man in the middle.
Me.
Yeah.
Government doesn't make a difference to what?
You said government doesn't make a difference. Would you give
I don't think I
government
did.
more power?
I don't-
No, just bear with me a second. Just that's my
Certainly not in
assertion.
Singapore.
The second
Would
thing
you
what I
mind,
don't
can we have,
Okay,
two
the
things.
question is
Would
this.
you tell us who you are? And then
Sorry,
could you
my
put us
name's
a
Michael
question?
Foster.
Yeah.
Belong to this organisation or whatever.
Yeah.
I contribute to it in some odd way. But what I don't understand about any of this is you've got a situation here where you're talking about the state of the nation. And you talk in your book, Feudalism, about where we are in democracy. We're seeing an absolute sweep across Europe of right-wing nationalism, populism. You have it in America with the States. All of this is about income inequality. You talked about people in the falabas near you sitting 3 in a kitchen. And then you talk about the oligarchs and what it does. And it's as if suddenly all these people are changing the world and protecting the world and growing the economy. As you put in your book, the richest time people have ever been that are what we would call the working classes, the people that are now voting for Maloney, people that are voting for Trump, was in 1350, when the population so declined. And what I don't understand about any of this, if you don't have the people with you in a democracy, there is no resilience. And at the moment, we're just taking money away from these people. 1971, you were talking about 1978, 57% of the money went to the working people, and 43% went to the owners. Now it's 30-70. The massive move against the majority of people that couldn't afford to be in this room.
We may not agree with you either, so have you got a particular question which you'd like the panel to answer?
Talk about income inequality when you talk about resilience of the nation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well,
so,
that's...
cohesion of society is income inequality. Has the free market delivered such an extent of inequality that we're losing cohesion of society?
Government reverses that. That's the purpose of government.
Well, theoretically. You know, I mean, I can tell you in the state of California, they have allowed and had policies that have made inequality much worse. So, you know, government is like a lot of things. It can be used, you can use a hammer to bash somebody in, and you can use a hammer to build a building. And right now, it's more like hitting people on the head. So, you know, I think that I agree that government is important and getting people motivated. I don't think that people are motivated by the left or the sort of Macron-like center. The problem is nobody's come up with a formula that seems to work. I don't know if you guys agree, but...
What I want to throw in is, does the size of the unit matter? I'm sometimes wonder whether nations or units which are between 5 and 11 million, actually not so small that they can't deliver things, but you know, when you look at your New Zealand and your New Sweden and Scandis, whether you've got an element of social cohesion, just simply by the way people relate to each other.
When it at least comes to Sweden, for example, it is relatively, you know, considered an equal society, but it is still a society where it is possible to be a tech billionaire, right? Spotify is a Swedish company, which is often forgotten. So I think we have to be very careful with regard to the trade-offs between cohesion and productivity. Where look, you know, even in antiquity, right, you might have had a lot of copper because you were a successful copper merchant, or you might have had a lot of copper because your raiders sacked a few cities and melted down all their bronze.
The Swedes were good at that.
They pivoted. But the key point here is that I think often the benefits of fighting inequality, which do exist contra to what some critics say, are defeating extractive elites. And there do exist around the world extractive elites. This is not controversial. The so-called resource curse is often an instantiation of this. Say, I don't know, inefficient state businesses being handed over for political favors in places like Mexico is an example, right? Even in Russia, right? The main reason Russia was not industrialized enough, really, despite, you know, to fight this war, despite spending so much on its defense, was because those were all cushy positions handed out for loyalty. And, you know, in his own way, Putin had to go through a creative destruction of purging them until he might or might not find someone that knows how to spend rubles to build artillery shells. And I would only say this, in the Western world, we are not unanimously governed by productive, economically positive elites. We sometimes have our own extractive elites, and sometimes our mechanisms of extraction are more sophisticated than that of simpler economies and simpler countries. So I'll maybe leave it at that.
Sure. I'm going to talk in a metaphorical and literal sense about my book for a second, which is to say that I take the point on income inequality. It doesn't seem to be an enormously good predictor of populism to me. If you look across the examples of different countries that have reacted in different ways, what I do think is a very good predictor of populism is engendering a sort of zero-sum economic game for a large portion of people who live there, which comes down enormously in this country when it comes to housing. Housing more than anything else. When you make the asset that almost everyone relies on something that not everyone can own at the same time, or at least not everyone can own the valuable parts at the same time, I think that's immensely dangerous. Yeah, I'm not sure what I think about the income inequality argument. Because, you know, the UK state, for example, does more redistribution than it ever has, right? We could say that we're starting from a position where you need to do more redistribution because something's wrong. You see some countries in Germany, obviously deindustrialization, the failure of East Germany as an economic sort of powerhouse is part of the rise of populism there. But when you look at Italy, it's the richer north voting for the populists, right? So, yeah, I'm not sure what I think about that.
Could I just throw a stink bomb?
Okay. A very quick one.
Okay. The issue of cohesion, that's why how we deal with immigration is going to be critical. Because even in Sweden now, they have problems that they haven't had in a long time. Now, all Western countries and frankly all East Asian countries are going to need immigrants, including, I know Singapore has quite a few.
It's got plenty.
But how we integrate them is going to be important for the cohesion. If you have where we've been going in the United States to essentially encourage this idea of, you know, the people of color against everybody else, you'll never have cohesion.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions. Gentleman at the top there, next one, and then followed the lady there, and then a third one there. Would you like to kick us off? Yeah.
Thank you very much. William Atkinson, Conservative Home and an outgoing Civic Future fellow. I'm just fascinated by that gentleman's argument, or tacit arguments over there, that the Black Death was a good thing because it raised the incomes of the worst off. But there we go. But no, I think one thing I just want to ask the panel about is the fact that we've talked an awful lot about resilience so far, but not so much about disorder. And it strikes me that each of the panelists have said something which is wholly rational, and rationalising in UK's particular context, rationalising our economy is a very good thing to do. But politics is by nature irrational. The world is becoming more disordered. And how, in that state of disorder, do we find the moment for policymakers to take a breath, to have these sort of conversations about how our economy should actually look like, than rather what it does look like, and to actually implement those sort of policies, because it strikes me that this is all very sound stuff, but it's all going to get lost in the mix as we hurtle towards a Third World War.
At the risk of paraphrasing what you've just said, because I'm not ever persuaded that the electorate is irrational. I think the electorate may sometimes not be terribly articulate, but it's actually very rational in how it arrives at what there serves them best. And then the argument goes that the politicians know what they ought to be doing, but they feel they don't get elected if they articulate it. And that's the. Is that our big challenge?
Yeah, but I agree with you that actually the voters are not as stupid as people think they are, or even that the politicians think they are. For instance, there's a lot of pushback now about Trump now winning a significant portion of the Hispanic vote. And the typical progressive line will be, well, they're voting against their own interests. Well, if I'm working in an oil field in Texas and I'm making more money than anybody in my family has ever made, and my job is being threatened, I might feel a little bit negative about it. If I'm living in South Texas and all of a sudden there are hundreds of thousands of people, added to the labor force that I'm competing with, maybe I have a different feeling. So I don't think people are really that irrational. I think that they may not know how to address their problems, but what's happened in the United States with groups that have traditionally been, for instance, solidly democratic, now beginning to move to the center and even to the right, is not. It's not really irrational. If you're dealing with crime, you're dealing with dysfunctional schools, you're dealing with economic dislocation, people are trying to react, and they figure that the politician who at least identifies those problems is somebody they may support.
Sorry, just to make clear,
Yeah.
I wasn't talking about the electorates being irrational. I was talking about politicians and policymakers. I'm not talking about the electorates.
Oh, that's even worse. That's an even greater charge. So could you just elaborate on that? That if you think why would the politicians wish to be irrational?
Well, because human beings by nature are irrational, and the process of policy making has to occur at speed, contending with forces beyond one's control. So even if we can sit in a room like this and have a nice 2-hour conversation about what needs to be done, the actual politician sort of sat at their desk is not going to have the opportunity to try and implement this because they're dealing with crisis after crisis. And so that's what I mean, is that how do we create the space for people to actually have those rational conversations at the top of politics, those sort of year zero, Lee Kuan Yew, this is how I'm going to found a state and this is how I'm going to do it, sort of discussions and actions, rather than, politicians trying to maximise their interest by saying what the voters want them to hear.
Okay. Joel, Mike, would you like to
think
come?
as
And then
Lee
I'm
Kuan
going
Yew
to
has
put
mentioned,
Mike,
I'm sort of
and I'm going to put
required to
Michael Gove on notice.
Sure.
That before I take the next question, I'm going to invite Michael Gove to disillusion ourselves and prove that politicians are rational and not irrational, if that is okay.
Sure. So I think it's an interesting discussion, and basically the absence of the sort of philosopher kings that you'd want running things is something that comes up a lot. And I often have people ask me about Singapore. I live in Singapore, and they ask because they see this sort of what they believe is a relatively enlightened government, bureaucracy, governing class of people. What I would say is that the idea of a year zero, I personally think is the wrong way to look at it, from the perspective that Lee Kuan Yew and the early governors of Singapore in the independence years dealt with crises far more severe than anything that faces the UK now. They did not get a moment to sit down and say, here's a new society and we'll build it this way. The challenges were, you had essentially Indonesia and Malaysia in a small war that Singapore was caught in the middle of. You had poverty, you had slums, almost everything was worse, and I guarantee you the crises were much worse. If I had a good answer as to how we facilitate leadership like that, I would not be a journalist sort of heckling from the cheap seats. Those of you going into public life are going to have to sort that out for us. But I would say that the people, nobody ever gets a chance to govern in a sort of clean, let's sit down and work out what the good way of doing it would be. It's the fact that people are able to do it while the crisis is happening that's the impressive thing in my view.
One comment, if I may, would be there was a statement by Henry Kissinger that I think is illustrative of this, which is that public office expends rather than builds intellectual capital. So earlier in life, Kissinger had time to contemplate philosophy, work out his political and historical views. He actually wrote about them at great length in his PhD thesis, his books, so on. And then later in life, with varying success, he attempted to apply them to the world. And I think this is about the best we can get to the philosopher king model. I would encourage, for better policy and more reasoned policy, but also better goal setting, to have very well worked out and robust ways of processing new information about the world. Every model you can find, verify, figure out is sound, is a machine waiting for new information. A few years ago when friends asked me, Samo, what news sources should we follow about the Syrian civil war? This was 2014, so like a decade ago. I was like, don't follow any news sources. Read these 5 books if you actually want to understand the news. And just stop following the news for 6 months and then go back to it. And the friend, to his credit, actually did that and said, you were completely right. I needed to understand who Assad was. I needed to understand like the history of Syria. I needed to understand like this or that political movement. And, that's what I think we should aim for in government, right? And honestly, the only way to do that is for people who are responsive to argument and who see that other people have developed systematic ways of viewing the world. I think they should just ruthlessly discriminate against those who don't. I think there are many people who operate on vibes, and like vibes and technocratic vibes, they don't necessarily get along. So there is a cognitive phenotype. I wouldn't go as far as to say selecting for like Asperger's, though Silicon Valley is attempting this. But there is a kind of person that even if you seem to disagree with them super strongly politically, actually the way you're thinking and the way you'll respond to a crisis is very similar. So, find people who approach philosophy and politics the same way.
And I just one thing, and this is also, I did a lot of work in Singapore, so we were talking about it. In a way, you need fewer bureaucrats and more really good civil servants. Yeah. And one of the things that I taught at the Civil Service College in Singapore. And what they do is that, their people are incredibly well educated, particularly at the higher levels. And the other thing is that their status in society. In Western society, civil servants are kind of the dregs of, in some ways, of the professional classes.
Steady on.
I told you I'm going to throw as many stink bombs as I can. But I think what I found really inspiring is you had really, really high status for really smart people in the civil service. So then when the civil service said something, people said, well, they've been right about this and this. And I think this question of, at the same time, you don't have to be in favor of a bigger government, but you want a smarter government, and you want a government that's run by people who respect themselves and are respected.
Just for the record, we've got some pretty smart civil servants as well. Michael, would you just like to address that decision-making in a rational way under pressure, and what we might learn from that?
Yes. The great Charlie Munger made the point that the best guide to any organization and its behavior is to look at incentives. Show me the incentives and I will show you the behavior. For politicians, the principal incentive is securing votes. Politicians are vote maximizing creatures. And when it comes to responding to decisions, you can't expect any human being, let alone a politician, to act as a rational calculating machine, a platonic guardian capable of weighing up all of the public goods and then coming to the right solution. They'll be thinking about who are my people, who elected me, who will sustain me in office. But there is something that moderates that moderates the democratic temper, the voting or vote-gathering impulse, which is also the esteem of peers. So one of the classic arguments for the mixed British constitution of the 19th century was that, yes, a democratic temper was a great thing, but also you wanted to have an aristocratic culture amongst those who were decision makers, because they would feel that it mattered to them and to the top 100, 500, 2,000, 3,000, how they were regarded. And the vulgar pursuit of votes, populism if you will, or plundering resource in order to buy political favor, would ultimately mean they would be seen as lesser figures in the eyes of others whose esteem they sought. And again, politicians in the 19th century in England look back, of course, to Roman times, to the ideal of the pre-Caesar republic, where again, a sense of aristocratic virtue acted as a restraint. So the elder Cato and Cicero on the one side, Catiline and Caesar on the other. Why do I mention it now? Because there are politicians who are still vote maximizing, but increasingly politicians are also looking to different types of elites who will reward them for their actions as well as the populace. And now it's no longer, as it were, the top 100, 300 or 5,000 who share that set of assumptions. It's pressure groups and other organizations which can help shape the public debate, whether that's through social media, agitation, or elsewhere. So politicians are torn between the desire to serve the democratic temper and the pressure that comes from other groups whose esteem they solicit. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Lady there for another question, and if you can have another microphone, you've got it. Thank you. If you tell us who you are.
Yes, I'm Elizabeth Brough. I'm with the Atlantic Council, previously with Rusi. Now, the title was Resilience in the era of disorder, and I would like to hear more about resilience. National resilience to threats coming from outside our country, specifically in this case outside the UK. We've talked a lot about domestic disharmony, but there are considerable number of threats coming from other countries, not just of an economic kind. And so the question is, I think, that needs to be addressed is, who should be resilient? Is it just the government? Is it the rest of society as well? And how do we combine those resilience efforts?
Thank you. Who would like to kick us off with that question?
Well, I think with national security, it is expensive. Someone has to pay for it, and it's always very tricky to determine what the right level of funding is, and more importantly, how efficient the funding is. Around the world, countries that spend comparable amounts of funds on defense get really different results, with some countries receiving at least, the not, completely worth it, but nice to have benefit of advanced R&D and like world leadership in technology. There's the libertarian story of American success, which is true, but there's also the national security state story of American success that's true. And I think the situation the Western world finds itself is a world where, well, China is the world's factory. So if it came down to a competition as to who can build more artillery shells or who can build more drones, it will have the advantage. And if China does not choose to sanction a country like Russia, then the Russian economy will not implode, even if everyone else sanctions them, because China is just so big. I don't think it is viable to compete on quantity in that way for a country like Britain, or for a country, honestly, like South Korea, or even Japan. Maybe it's possible for the United States, right? Or some sort of economic union, hypothetically, of the US and Japan and Britain, but no one's even thinking about that. That's a whole different planet. But to finish my thought, I do think that Britain could easily aspire to be a world leader in technology, in a particular militarily relevant technology, surpassing even the United States in its concentrated investment. One could easily imagine Britain leaping ahead in quantum computing, maybe breaking US encryption, upsetting their allies, but then offering better encryption to the allies. And of course, also leapfrogging ahead of China in the process. One could imagine Britain leapfrogging ahead in AI. Again, this still would slightly upset the US, but not as much as if China did so. So that kind of development defense policy is important. And the world, the title is disorder because we in Europe for the first time have a significant challenge to the post-war peace. I come from Slovenia. I was part of a, entity called Yugoslavia at one point, but people perceive that rightly or wrongly as very regional war, right? It's undeniable now with North Korean engineers going to Ukraine, and with, of course, Western support of Ukraine and the Chinese tacit okayness with Russian aggression, that this is potentially destabilizing to the world order. And I think that's why we're talking about things like, is it maybe worth paying the cost of an efficient defense state? And then I think my argument would be that Britain doesn't make a difference with artillery shells, but might make a difference with high-tech weaponry, if it chooses to make that its national purpose and defense strategy.
Sure. When you started asking the question, my immediate thought was, oh God, I don't, you know more about this than me. And I think that actually gets to one of the issues, which is that you have these two worlds clashing into each other, which are one, national security related, a lot of expertise in that area, one, business, corporate, economics, and there's not an enormous number of people in the middle that feel extremely confident that they know enough about both to understand where the trade-offs are. When I go around different parts of Asia and I talk to businesses who want to operate in the US, they freak out about this stuff because they're like, they only listen to national security people now. I don't have a congressman I can talk to. I don't have a senator I can talk to. And ultimately, I think if I was going to say people need to build a sort of understanding of one thing, it's where these worlds intersect. I certainly don't have a good enough one. But I ask the questions about the trade-offs. I don't know where they are. It worries me to see the idea of sort of efficiencies reduced, but maybe I'm just wrong about the level of the threat, and maybe the threat does require that. You look at a country like Singapore, actually, and it manages, in many things, to do both, in the sense that you've got this extremely, by Western standards, interventionist, like civil defense system, right? Every modern Singaporean building, every private home has to have a room within it that will withstand a bomb blast, right? These are used as pantries, right, in normal people's homes. Now, you could ask yourself, what on earth is the threat to Singapore that people are worried about that requires every private home to have these? But that's the sort of mindset that you get into if you're constantly thinking about these things. I don't know whether that's the right direction, but it's a very different path. Yeah.
It just, I do think that I don't necessarily think that Britain by itself is going to be a great defense leader even in the tech field, but where I think Britain has a tremendous future is that as part of an alliance of countries of similar mentality, if you will, like obviously all the English-speaking countries, but also Japan, maybe India to some extent. You're going to have to come up with some sort of new system of alliances, and the old one, which was really built around NATO, is obviously antiquated. It doesn't cover the important parts of the world anymore. We do try to make some adjustments, like with Canada, but I do think that the UK, in its defense side, is going to have to look at alliances, and alliances that are much, much bigger than NATO. I think that's absolutely the case.
Maybe the real threat is complacency,
yes.
And the real threat is that we don't become adaptable. And so if you look at defense, AUKUS, really it's the second pillar on technology, which is really the important thing. So I think there are things out there and they're coming into place, but the question is, are we really going to utilize them? Final question. Yeah, the man with the microphone.
Sorry. Thank you. My name is Matej, I'm a reporter. I have a website at reporter.london, and I work on international financial investigations with the ICIJ out of Washington. I'm not here as a reporter. I'm here to expand my mind, and as always with Civic Future, this is happening. Thank you for this. My question is simple. How much time do we have to get our shit together before World War III starts? Thank you.
That's a little question.
I have to say, my attempts to end up on something positive, you really have thrown the spanner in the works now. I thought we were sort of negative enough, and now you challenge us to... And Tom Lehrer answers are not allowed. So how much time have we got?
I sort of think that the United States has a lot of weight as to what happens in terms of escalation of great power conflicts with China. And that I actually think, and this is going to be a bit controversial, that China is pressuring its neighbors, in particular Taiwan, but its ambitions around the world and its ability to have loyal allies is very limited. Even Russia is not truly a Chinese ally through thick and thin. They're currently joined at the hip out of industrial desperation. So there is no global Axis 2.0, there is no global Comintern right now. The whole BRICS discourse is always overblown. There's not going to be like a revolutionary economic switch happening. Most of Belt and Road is actually malinvestment. They're getting pitiful returns, and they're not getting that much political influence by trying to build docks and railroads in Pakistan and in Africa. Like, they thought they would get more, but they're not. And in a way, China is facing some of the same problems we are. Almost every time when you talk about, low birth rates or like environmental problems or excessive spending, any social problem, any political problem you can think of in a Western country, including something like populism, because while the CCP does not have elections, they poll the population obsessively because they're paranoid about their government being overthrown by a sudden movement. China has these same problems. China will not have that many young people to send to die in 20 or 30 years, right? The average age of their soldiers will be much, much higher every single year that, there is no great conflict. And I think currently they're prioritizing being wealthy over hurrying that timeline. And you can tell that they're prioritizing being wealthy because while they are building up their nuclear deterrent, which is concerning, they want to match the United States and Russia and have a giant arsenal of thousands of warheads. You've seen all the moon probes and stuff. They want to send a person there just symbolically to achieve equality with the US. So they have a competitiveness to the US, but they're not doing the kind of preparation you would expect in a real war. There's no expansion of domestic oil production. No, there's not. They're not expanding domestic oil production. They're building refineries in Australia or whatever. I mean, maybe the disappointing but hopeful message is that China still just wants to get rich. And it wants to get rich, and it doesn't care about being fair. But, a big world war actually gets in the way of being rich.
I think we actually managed to end on a sort of point of relative agreement, in the sense that both I agree that there is no Chinese-led world order. You go to Southeast Asia, speak to ordinary people, it's not there. Among a few governments where the political elite has essentially been purchased, sure, very small number, relatively small populations. You then have to think about this question of preparation, and this is where we may differ a little bit, which is that to prepare, you have to reduce the interdependencies, right? But by reducing the interdependencies, you also lower the cost of upping the stakes, right? There's less concern about pursuing confrontation on both sides if they're less reliant on each other. This is the bit that I worry about. So I would say it's very dangerous to start from a perspective of how do we get our shit together for this conflict that is coming. And our main focus should be, yes, there's an element of preparation you always have to do for things you hope will never come, but we should still be focused on how to sort of get off ramps so that we don't think of this as an inevitability. I think there probably are things that the Chinese and American governments could both do to sort of essentially, if you're a Chinese leader or a US leader at the moment, there's an element of if you try to extend a hand out in the other direction, you're a bit of a mug, right? The direction of travel is all one way. It's all towards more confrontation. We need to find ways of there being a little bit more of an off-ramp for both sides, I think.
Just a last comment, which is basically, I think that the biggest problem from the Western side is a lack of confidence in our system and our values. We don't believe in them, and yet I think we have an enormous advantage, particularly given our ties through immigration. You go around the world, people look up to the US, they look up to the UK, because these are seen as better places. And as long as we have that confidence, we may be able to deal with a China from a much stronger place than if we think the Chinese are somehow are superior and have this overwhelming power, we may overreact. I think if we're more confident, we may be able to deal with this before we get to World War III.
Well, on that positive note, which actually tells us that maybe what we need to do is just remind ourselves and learn to re-articulate that liberal democracies actually do deliver better societies, and that working markets add and contribute to that, and get with that message. And on that note, which means I'm now between you and your dinner, and after dinner the bar opens, that's even more of a reason why I should not come between you. I wanted to thank the panel, I wanted to thank you, and I wish you well for the rest of the conference.